Hello, my name is Rose, and I'm the program manager here at the Scott County Historical Society. And today I'm going to be taking you on a tour through our brand new exhibit, HomeBrewed, Prohibition in Scott County. So I'm going to try to be as thorough as possible. I'll read through the different panels, show you the artifacts we have on display, and then also give you some supplemental information and photos. So thanks for coming along with me on this tour, and I hope you enjoy it. The first thing I'd like to do is take a moment to thank our great sponsors for this exhibit. Both are very fitting sponsors. RAR has been around since before Prohibition and, unsurprisingly, was impacted by the 18th Amendment. Bill's Toggery opened in 1931 at the tail end of Prohibition. At the time, they specialized in dry cleaning services. The store would also have been just a block up from the Rock Spring Cafe, a charming restaurant that also happened to have a speakeasy in the basement. So by way of introduction, I'm going to show you a little bit of the whole scale of the exhibit, some of the things you'll be seeing, and then I'm also going to read the introductory panel for you. So the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, commonly called Prohibition, banned the sale, production, and import of alcohol across the country. When it passed in 1919, America became a dry country overnight and remained one for the next 13 years. While proponents of the amendment hope to cure the troubles of society, the success or failure of this noble experiment is still debated today. Prohibition did permanently reduce the amount of alcohol consumed by Americans. It also contributed to a nationwide rise in organized crime. Across the nation, in big cities, small towns, bootleggers ran liquor while law enforcement struggled to stop them. Commemorating the 100th anniversary of the passage of Prohibition, this exhibit looks back at the rum runners, moonshiners, and prohibitionists that called Scott County home. Moving right along, next you're going to get a little bit of backstory as to why the United States would want to pass a law like Prohibition in the first place. Starting out with the Drive movement. As you can guess, the movement towards Prohibition did not begin with the 18th Amendment. As early as the 1830s, you start to see religious organizations and women's groups advocating for temperance in the United States and emphasizing the evils that alcohol placed on society and on families. By the 1850s, opponents of alcohol were organized more formally into the temperance movement, which sought to limit, if not completely eliminate, alcohol in the United States. This movement gained steam at the turn of the 20th century and became a political force to be reckoned with, one of the first planks of the progressive movement. In just 2 decades, the temperance movement gained enough national attention and political traction that it was possible for complete prohibition to pass in the United States. Zooming into local history, as we will see going forward, the temperance movement never gained the foothold in Scott County that it did elsewhere in the nation. We do know of 2 temperance organizations in the county, the Reform Club, which started as a German men's group in 1875, and the Abstinence Society, which we believe started in 1896. This article encouraging people to attend the Reform Club is from the Scott County Argus, August 17, 1877. Now, this doesn't mean these were the only temperance organizations in the county. It's likely that some religious groups advocated for alcohol reform, among other issues, or that other organizations that focus solely on temperance existed but have been lost to history. So 2 major progressive movements worked to outlaw alcohol: the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League. For the Temperance Union, prohibition was a means to improve domestic life and specifically the lives of women. Temperance advocates argued that alcohol was the root of many of society's issues, such as poverty and domestic violence. The Anti-Saloon League, in contrast, saw the saloon as a source of political corruption. Eliminating saloons would contribute to a more just and lawful society. Together, the 2 groups led the cause to have alcohol outlawed. This established small clubs across the country and began a grassroots campaign to influence lawmakers. To modern eyes, the emphasis on saloons as a source of corruption might seem a little bit odd. But saloons held a different place in pre-Prohibition society than they do today. They generally just served beer, and often only one variety. Saloons were explicitly, or at least de facto, often men's institutions, and not a place where men and women would come and socialize together. Because of this, saloon life was entirely separate from family life. Saloons were also sometimes, in practice, headquarters for political parties, hence one of the concerns with overall corruption stemming from saloon culture. Saloons were overwhelmingly working class institutions. Wealthier people would gather at clubs or hotels. And finally, as immigration skyrocketed in the United States, saloons were gathering places for immigrant groups where languages other than English were spoken. As prejudice against immigrant groups rose, especially against Germans against the backdrop of World War I, many saloons became associated explicitly with immigrations in people's minds. This next section really does have a lot of local connections because there was a huge German population in Scott County. And before 1913, liquor had two great allies, taxes and German immigrants. Nearly 30% of the government's income came from liquor taxes, while German immigrant communities with long cultural ties to alcohol and strong connections to the brewing industry made natural supporters of the alcohol industry. German and Czech immigrants across the country, including in Scott County, were quick to organize in support of alcohol. Prohibition threatened to upset cultural institutions and, for many, also upset livelihoods. In the late 1910s, sentiments had shifted. The income tax of 1913 provided the government with new sources of income, reducing the dependency on alcohol sales. World War I turned national sentiment against German immigrants. Support for the German-influenced brewing industry was often seen as unpatriotic. As you saw in the chart earlier, at the time of Prohibition, Scott County was heavily German and Czech, with much of the Czech population centered in the southern part of the county near New Prague. If you look here, you can see a headline. Now, this is a column that ran weekly in the Scott County Argus called News from Fatherland, which told what was happening in Germany. This column disappeared soon after World War I broke out. December 18, 1917, the U.S. Congress passed a resolution containing the language of the 18th Amendment and presented the amendment for ratification by the states. 15 states ratified the amendment by July 1919, and the required 36 states had ratified by January 16, 1919. Prohibition passed the Minnesota legislature after the resolution had the required number of ratifications on January 17, 1919. The vote was 92 to 36 in the House and 48 to 11 in the Senate. The ratified amendment, however, needed legislation before it could be enforced. That legislation was called the Volstead Act, named for the Minnesota Congressman Andrew John Volstead. The law made illegal the production, transportation, and sale of alcohol, but did not outlaw consumption or possession. President Woodrow Wilson vetoed the Volstead Act, but Congress overrode the veto. Prohibition went into effect at 12:01 a.m. on January 17, 1920. So as we know, folks in Scott County seem to be, on the whole, very much against Prohibition. But I actually want to take this opportunity to introduce you to some of the folks that were representing Scott County on the national level. So here we have Henry Martin Arns. He was the Minnesota State Representative at the time, and William J. Kuntz, who was the state senator. So Kuntz was born in Carver County and went to St. Cloud for school to study teaching, but he actually never pursued the career. Instead, after returning home, he was elected to the Municipal Council of Waconia and then to the Waconia School Board, and went from there to pursue a career in politics. In 1915, he was on the Minnesota House of Representatives, and he served there until 1918 when he was elected to the Senate. He was very much against Prohibition and served in the Senate until 1922, voting against every bit of Prohibition legislation that came his way. We have a similar anti-Prohibition stance for Henry Arns. Arns was a German immigrant. His family came from Germany in 1889. And just after arriving in Scott County, in about a year, he was elected to Jordan's Municipal Council, where he served until 1892. In 1919, he was elected to the Minnesota House of Representatives, and he was a strong opponent of Prohibition. By trade, he was actually the treasurer of the Jordan Cooperative Creamery, and after retiring from public service, he helped found Land O'Lakes Creamery and served as vice president there until 1933. Now, once Prohibition ended, communities in Scott County had to decide what to do about it. One impact of Prohibition is that it destroyed a long-established industry in many small towns, saloons. Now, many saloon owners foresaw the impact Prohibition would have and switched to serving soft drinks or opening cafes. But these soft drink parlors and cafes were sometimes fronts for another less legal operation, speakeasies. So the back rooms would be a place where patrons could enjoy a quiet, illegal drink. Now, some of these speakeasies actually did have elaborate codes, like you'd think of from the movies, to keep their operations safe. So here we see a picture of the Rock Spring Cafe in Shakopee. And we know the Rock Spring Cafe had a password that would allow customers into the speakeasy in the back. Unfortunately, we do not know what that password was. Now, one thing I want to draw your attention to right here is this beautiful barrel. So this barrel is on loan from the Chaska Historical Society, and it's from Chaska Bottling Company. Now, Chaska Bottling Company was one of the operations that switched to soft drinks during Prohibition in order to stay afloat. Let's get into speakeasies a little bit more. Speakeasies were common, not just in the back rooms of Scott County restaurants and soda parlors, but in all kinds of unusual places. For example, there was an article in the Belle Plaine Herald that claimed a barber shop was raided for liquor. We'll likely not know how many speakeasies there were in Scott County, but they were more common than you'd think. So here's a few artifacts I want to share with you from some of the Scott County speakeasies. So this is a beer tap from the St. Paul House. And the St. Paul House was a speakeasy in Scott County. This beer tap was used during the 1910s and early 1920s. And this establishment was also called the St. Paul Hotel. It was owned by Herbert Nyssen, who also owned Shakopee Brewery prior to Prohibition. Now we also have these beautiful labels. Now these labels are on loan from Elaine Barber, and they marked bottles of soda that were produced by the New Prague Bottling Company during the 1930s at the end of Prohibition. Moving around back behind the bar, we also have some glass cups here. So this cup is also on loan from Elaine Barber. Thank you so much. And this cup is an example of some of the detailed and expensive products that bars would produce to promote themselves and their patrons. So you can see this beautiful cup from Rybrook Brewery in New Prague. And here's another beautiful cup. This one is from Shakopee Brewery. Now I just want to show you a few of the speakeasies that we know about in Scott County. So first here we've got the Wagner Club. So the Wagner Club was located on Broadway in Jordan, although we're not sure of the exact location. This photograph is of downtown Jordan in 1930. We also have the Ryback Bar. So this bar was in New Prague, Minnesota, and it was owned by the same family that bought the New Prague Bottling Company. Moving down, I want to just show you this interior photograph of Welchman's Saloon. Now this is an example of one of the saloons that would have closed during the time of Prohibition, and we saw a few of those earlier as well. Over here we have the Rivera Club. So the Rivera Club was located near Riverside Park along the river in Shakopee. Now this building is part of the old fairgrounds, and it was also known to be a speakeasy during Prohibition. Up here we have the Mill Pond Club. Now this photo is the one we have. It's actually from a flood in 1965, but it was a well-known speakeasy that was on the banks of the Minnesota River just outside of Shakopee. And actually, even after Prohibition, this establishment had a reputation for illegal gambling. Down here we have the St. Paul House, which is where that tap is from. Now this picture was taken in 1965. During Prohibition, it was also a known speakeasy. It had a hotel and a restaurant, and after Prohibition, it was bought and renovated, but it continued to have a reputation for its gambling machines throughout the 1940s. And then up here, we have the good old Rock Spring Cafe. So the Rock Spring Cafe was located on First Avenue in downtown Shakopee, and it was a lunchroom and soda parlor, and it was owned and operated by the Rees family, who also owned the bottling works in Shakopee. Today, the location is home to Turtle's Bar and Grill. And I actually want to zoom in a little bit to the Rees family and the Rock Spring Cafe. And we're going to go back and take a look at this picture back here. So the woman on the far right of this photo is Elizabeth Rees. So she was the daughter of Jacob Rees, and she was the owner of the Rock Spring Cafe. She was also, at the time, the mayor of Shakopee. And this really tells you a lot about the culture of speakeasies in Shakopee. Most of the speakeasies were not glitzy affairs or riddled with organized crime. They continued to operate in the same quiet way that many saloons had operated before Prohibition. They were simply community gathering spots. Prohibition definitely has left one lasting impact on U.S. culture. It led to the rise of soda. It was a natural switch for many brewing facilities. They already had machines for bottling in many cases, and it only required a little bit of extra equipment to make the transition. So some companies, like the New Prague Bottling Works and Jacob Rees Bottling Works, immediately switched to soda. Other companies, unfortunately, like the Shakopee Brewery pictured here, were forced to close. The Jordan Brewery was as well. Schultz and Hilger's Brewery in Jordan actually rented out their building as a chicken hatchery during Prohibition. So here I want to show you a few artifacts from that time that have to do with soda barreling. So here we have some New Prague bottles. These are from the New Prague Brewing Company, owned by the Rybak family. They're one of the companies that switched from beer to soda. We also have some bottles from Jacob Rees Bottling Work. So the soda brand, which you may recognize, was Rock Spring Beverages. And you have a few crates from these companies. So we have this crate here from New Prague Brewing Company, as well as a Rock Spring shipping crate that were used to share some more artifacts I wanted to share with you. So here we've got a photograph of Jacob Rees Bottling Works in Shakopee. And then over here, we've got some of the stencils that were used to create the crates for Rock Spring Bottling Works. This would be a great time to introduce you to some of the historic breweries in Scott County. So the first brewery I want to tell you about is Shakopee Brewery. It was the first brewery we know of in the Minnesota River Valley, and it opened in 1855. The facility was founded by H.H. Strunk, who you also may know as the proprietor of Strunk Drug. Strunk owned Shakopee Brewery until, interested in other pursuits, he sold the business in 1863 to a man named Andrew Winkler. Winkler passed away in 1870, but afterwards, Winkler's widow Mary continued to manage brewery operations. 5 years later, she married a German master brewer named Hubert Nissen, and the two continued to run Shakopee Brewery together. Unfortunately, the building was destroyed by fire in 1885. Fire was a huge concern in early brewing due to the dangerous combination of wood or coal heating and the dry airborne dust produced when grain is industrially ground. Luckily, the family had enough capital to invest in rebuilding the facility, and Shakopee Brewery remained a fixture of the community until it was forced to close by Prohibition. You can still see the ruins of the brewery today along the Minnesota River bike path on the northwest edge of the city. So this is Jordan Brewery, and it was founded in 1866. And like Shakopee Brewery, it was started by a prominent local businessman, in this case Frank Nicholin. The structure of the building was built to last, with limestone and brick walls that were more than 3 feet thick. Nicholin sold the building soon after its opening, and in 1867 it took the name Sand Creek Brewing, run by partners Sebastian Gehrig and Frank Payer, who ran the business for almost 20 years. In 1885, they sold to Peter Schutz and William Kaiser. Kaiser left the partnership, and by 1902 it was finally owned jointly by Peter Schultz and Peter Hilgers, whose names have remained with the brewery building ever since. Like breweries around the county, Schutz and Hilgers closed in 1920, but reopened immediately upon Prohibition's repeal in 1933. At its height, the brewery brewed 40,000 barrels of beer annually and distributed to 7 states. In 1946, the facilities were bought by Mankato Brewing Company, but were soon forced to shut down due to financial difficulties. Finally, in 1954, the building caught fire during construction work and nearly burned to the ground. The ruins were left vacant for many years until the city considered demolishing the property. Today, it is listed on the National Register of Historic Places and has been refurbished into retail property. Now, this is the location of Koch's Brewery in New Prague. And Koch's Brewery was started by brothers-in-law Thomas Kochs and Albert Menars in 1884. Kochs, like many other local brewery owners, was a prominent businessman who also owned the general store. It was located at the corner of 2nd Avenue Northwest and 5th Street North, and it advertised itself as using, quote, clear hops and malts and having a modern steam-operated plant. Menars left the partnership in 1887, but Kochs remained an active owner for many years. The brewery was a prominent local employer and delivered barrels to many small communities nearby New Prague. When Prohibition hit in 1920, the facility tried to switch to selling soft drinks and malted non-alcoholic beverages, but this new business model was just not profitable, and the business closed in 1931. Today, the historic building houses apartments. Finally, we have Schmidt Brewery in Belle Plaine, and this brewery was opened by Albert Swinger in 1860. only cost $500 to build and was located northeast of town along what came to aptly be known as Brewery Creek. In 1866, Schmidt Brewery fell victim, like many other early breweries, to a fire, and Swinger was forced to rebuild. Ownership of the brewery fluctuated after the fire. City records list several different proprietors, but finally Christian Schmidt purchased the brewery in 1871. In 1877, the building burned down again and was rebuilt by Schmidt. For many years, Schmidt Brewery was a local business with a capacity of 10 barrels per day. Eventually, Schmidt began to expand, increasing the capacity to 500 barrels per year and starting a bottling line. But unfortunately, his health was failing. In 1905, Schmidt passed away, leaving the brewery to his sons. It finally closed in 1916 after being outsold by competition from larger regional brewing facilities. So here we have a few more artifacts from local Scott County businesses. So this is a shipping box from Schultz and Hilger Brewery in Jordan after they reopened. And we also have some labels from distilleries in the area. So Northern Distilleries started in the old Shakopee Brewing Building in 1936. Then they actually closed permanently in 1941. So I just want to get a close up and get you a chance to see some of these different labels from alcohol that was being produced in Scott County not long after Prohibition. So taking you over here to our brewing shed, I want to show you a replica of what a still might have looked like in Scott County during Prohibition. So this one's all shiny and new in copper, but you can easily see how these pieces might have been simply manufactured with things people had at home. And in fact, having an understanding of what brewing looked like, how to brew, and how to distill alcohol was relatively common knowledge at the time. It isn't something that would have been far-fetched for many people to pursue. While we're by the still, I'm going to take advantage of this opportunity to share with you some of the stories of what bootlegging was like in Scott County. While you listen, take a look at these photographs from each year of Prohibition that will give you a taste of what life was like in the county during this time. So our first story is Belle Plaine bootleggers. In Belle Plaine, a pair of brothers operated a still in one of their homes located next to a vacant lot where they built an automobile paint shop as a cover for their illicit business. They built a tunnel from the house to the garage, allowing them to transport their product without being seen, then loaded their product in trucks in the garage and transported it from there to Shakopee for distribution. After a year in business, the paint shop burned down, forcing the brothers to move their operation into their mother's house. Unfortunately, the still burned a hole in the floor, revealing their operation to their mother, who knew nothing about their illegal activity. Finally, the brothers moved the production to an abandoned cereal factory near the train tracks. They bought and maintained livestock to the barn, and to hide the smell, they covered the whiskey with planks and manure to keep it hidden. The business came to an end when one of the brothers was arrested on a run to Shakopee. According to the source, the brother spent a year in prison for bootlegging and the production of alcohol, but the other brother stayed clear. They did not resume their operation. Don't try this at home. Even without a still, thirsty Scott County residents could make booze at home with just a little extra work, and companies were quick to help. Grape juice companies produced concentrated blocks for making grape juice, which included explicit methods for keeping the juice from fermenting. People quickly realized, of course, that doing the opposite of these instructions produced the wine that they wanted. Beer companies tried to make alcohol-free beer, but the product didn't sell. Seeing the success of the grape juice concentrate, beer companies began selling alcohol-free beer with a packet of yeast and delivered instructions on how to avoid brewing it into beer. Unquenchable demand. As soon as Prohibition began, people across the county began producing illicit liquor, and Scott County was no exception. One of the more famous cases here was a man in Newmarket. In 1921, the man bragged to his friends that in the year and a half since beginning production, he had made $16,000. That would be around $22,400 in today's money. Not long after this alleged conversation, the man received a visit from a revenue agent who destroyed his still and took the man into custody. He served a year in prison. Outfoxed by potatoes. Some moonshiners were clever, hiding their liquor in unique ways. One example was a Shakopee moonshiner known only as Greason, who had a stock of liquor in his potato field. When someone came to buy a bottle, he gave them a location in the field, like 3rd row, 4th down. The buyer dug up the plant and found the bottle. The technique kept revenue agents from finding the alcohol when they raided the property. Walking with John Barleycorn. It's probably safe to say that most home stills were used only to meet the needs of the family. However, some individuals saw Prohibition as a great opportunity. They could ask top dollar for their liquor and people would gladly pay it. Stills in barns and haylofts of Scott County were common and easier to hide than they were in a town. The largest still in the county was found in an old barn in Eagle Creek. Frank Curtis ran the still and was the solitary landowner. Agents confiscated 50 gallons of moonshine ready for delivery, with more in production from him. Having a still in the backyard was not the only way people tried to get around regulations of alcohol during Prohibition. Church was actually another way. Sacramental wine was permitted for religious purposes with almost no regulation or oversight. Now, we don't have any accounts that suggest any churches in Scott County were part of a legal alcohol trade, but nationally, consumption of sacramental wine increased by 800,000 gallons between 1920 and 1921. And this is just a really beautiful related artifact that we wanted to share with you. So this is a chalice. It's from St. Joseph Catholic Church in Sand Creek Township that would have been used for sacramental wine. Medicine was another way that people tried to get around the laws and Prohibition. So here we've got a glass medicine bottle. It's an artifact from the SCHS collections. And it was legal to write prescriptions for hard alcohol during Prohibition. So even though you needed a license and no one could get a quart of alcohol or more than a quart of alcohol per month during Prohibition, whiskey sales produced nearly $400 million during Prohibition, a time that selling alcohol was supposed to be illegal. Talk about enforcement. Because enforcement of Prohibition was actually under the purview of the IRS. And these enforcers were called revenue agents. So revenue agents usually wore street clothes and they would raid speakeasies or businesses suspected of being speakeasies or even private homes looking for alcohol. So Scott County saw these raids throughout Prohibition, mostly in Jordan and Shakopee, and sometimes on seemingly legitimate businesses. So here we see an article about one of the raids, or a few of the raids actually, happening in Scott County. Now, raids were often done without the involvement of local police because it was thought that local police officers might tell people in advance that federal agents were coming. And local police didn't necessarily like this, so it often put federal agents and police at odds. Raids in Scott County were led by a man named Agent Tucker, who was based in Carver County and crossed the river monthly for his raids. Bootleggers and speakeasy operators in Shakopee got wise to this, though. They would actually pay children to sit at the bridge, on 1 Mile Bridge, with flashlights waiting for the liquor agents, and then they would flash the lights so dealers could stow their liquor. Concerns about raids and moonshine were not the only issue that Prohibition brought to Scott County. As Prohibition lingered on, changes in automotive technology combined with the substitution of homemade moonshine for weaker beer and wine led to a huge uptick in drunk driving. The following are a few stories from local newspapers addressing this concern. March 19, 1925, Belle Plaine Herald. A judge fined a man $200 and ordered him to the workhouse for 6 months for driving an auto on the street when he was so drunk he could scarcely remember his name. Now, personally, we never like to see anyone in trouble with the law, but this thing of driving an auto while intoxicated is becoming a problem too serious to overlook. The public streets and public roads of this county must be made safe. Shakopee Argus Tribune, August 19, 1926. Driving an automobile on our congested roads is a man-sized job for anyone who has a clear brain, and the moon-fogged fellow at the steering wheel has no business in any car. The automobile is a mighty dangerous weapon in the hands of one of these fellows. An uninvited guest always sits beside the drunken driver, the Grim Reaper. Moving right along, if you want the opportunity to be in your very own mugshot, you can do that here as part of this exhibit. Now, inevitably, Prohibition ended. There were lots of different reasons. The public had turned against it for reasons having to do with local crime. Also, the crumbling economy during the Great Depression led many to want the tax revenue that came in during Prohibition. So in 1933, the Collin-Harris Act allowed for the production and sale of beer and wine with only 3.2% alcohol. So this was actually a proposal put forward during the passage of the 18th Amendment, but it was pushed aside. The full repeal happened on December 5th, 1933. We showed you before that at the beginning of Prohibition, most folks in Scott County were not in favor of the law. Here we can see the votes to end Prohibition in Scott County, organized by town and township. And as you can see, the resistance to Prohibition did not fade. Most people in Scott County voted for repealing Prohibition all the way through the county. Not the end in Scott County. Businesses wasted no time returning to their roots. Many breweries reopened under the same or under new management. But with alcohol legal again, gambling actually became a very prominent activity in the county and even earned Shakopee the nickname Little Chicago. Speakeasies had raids by federal agents, and bars that once were looking out for the revenue agents were now looking out for the gaming commission. So Shakopee's criminal reputation didn't begin to change until 1946, when Pat Phelan was asked by Shakopee Mayor John Kavanaugh and other city leaders to clean up the town and force out the existing police chief. Eventually, these efforts led to the end of Shakopee's gambling problem. Phelan was actually promoted to police chief and served as chief from 1948 until 1978. So here we have one of these nefarious gambling devices. This is a slot machine. And the slot machine is from the 1920s. I'm going to just zoom up here and show you a little bit of this top of this. It's a beautiful machine. And this is an example of the sort of device that was common in hotels and bars during Shakopee, or during the Little Chicago era in Shakopee, that also would have gotten a business owner in trouble. Thanks so much for joining me on this tour of the Prohibition exhibit. And if you have any questions or any stories that you want to share from your family about Prohibition, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can email us at info@scottcountyhistory.org. And if you have certain interests that you want to explore relating to Prohibition, you should also feel free to search our collections, which can be found on our website at scottcountyhistory.org. Thank you, and I hope you have a great day.